Looking at entrepreneurship from an institutional lens seems obvious to me, but the fact is it's actually evidently not that obvious to other people, because traditionally much of the literature on entrepreneurship has taken a very individual level focus. So looking at kind of individuals' dispositions or their motives in terms of explaining why people become entrepreneurs. And that's evident in classic work, certainly, like Schumpeter's work, which everybody who studies entrepreneurship has to pay homage to. And Schumpeter talks about, kind of these daring individuals who spit in the face of risk and so on. To work by David McClellan, the psychologist, who explained why people get into entrepreneurship in terms of these needs for achievement that they have internalized, individual differences, sort of things. Kerzner, an economist who emphasizes having really sharp eyes. That's what makes people to be good entrepreneurs, that they can see opportunities that no one else sees, and so forth. And interestingly, so, that's classical work, but you still see that very individual level emphasis in contemporary work as well. So what I have here are just a kind of semi-random selection of titles of papers that were published in two journals that are often used by people who study entrepreneurship, Journal of Business Venturing and Entrepreneurship Theory and Practice. And I looked through the last 6 months of these two journals to look for research on why people became entrepreneurs. Seems to be less interest these days in understanding who becomes an entrepreneur, much more interest in what conditions allow entrepreneurial firms to survive. But those articles that did deal with this still show that very psychological kind of focus. So we've got individual intentions and their self-control and their emotions, their doubt, their fear, their aversion, affective valence, perceptions of whether they're making progress, variability, creative personalities, down to your gene pool. Very, very much of kind of this personal factor. If you want to understand entrepreneurship, you need to look at individual differences. It's kind of the implication. So I think, though, that surprising how little work there is on culture or cultural sources of entrepreneurship and attitudes that characterize a group in terms of, is becoming self-employed, being an entrepreneur, is that a good way to make a living? These are things that I would argue characterize whole groups of people, not just specific individuals. Things also about how do you do it if you decide that you want to become an entrepreneur. There are sort of group prescriptions about how to do this, I would argue. And I would argue that there's evidence for that in terms of the level of variation across countries in terms of attitudes and rates of self-employment that provides evidence of, well, we need to actually start looking at cultural, or what I would call institutional, sources of that. So that's what we're doing in this paper, and in particular, we want to consider entrepreneurship as an institution, and we want to focus on the implications for doing further research on entrepreneurship from this vantage point. In particular, we follow some of more current work from an institutional theoretic perspective that emphasizes the need to look at how general institutions can vary in kind of their specific manifestations in different places, different times. So you have a kind of overarching institutional pattern, but you also see that pattern change in different contexts slightly. And so trying to understand, what are the sources of variations in institutions. And in this paper, we focus on a couple of these sort of dimensions of entrepreneurship that vary and that we think illustrate some of the utility of looking at entrepreneurship as an institution and looking at variations in this institution. So one is typical pathways that are taken into entrepreneurship, and that is kind of the standard ways that people get into it. So we actually did a pretty extensive review of very different literatures on entrepreneurship. So there's a literature on ethnic entrepreneurship. There's a literature that you see in a lot of the business, sort of the management, which comes much more out of the Schumpeterian kind of tradition. Also literature on agglomeration, which is the kind of propensity for different geographical areas to generate a lot of entrepreneurial activity, and work on women in entrepreneurship. So these are different literatures. They're relatively siloed, and it's interesting to look across them and try and see, is there anything in common? So the pathways then comes partly out of the literature on ethnic entrepreneurship, but you also see it in others. And we identify 3 different kinds of pathways that characterize different groups. And second focus is looking at founders' relationships. And here we talk about kind of these types, solo, founder, and 2 kinds of team-based foundings, which is family-based, your family-owned firms, and then non-related teams. Okay, so the basic aim here is to essentially encourage, maybe even inspire more work on entrepreneurship from this vantage point, basically. So this is a research agenda that I'm laying out here. And let me begin by offering my definitions of some key terms. One is institution, which clearly has a lot of, a wide array of definitions. For our purposes, we define it as a pattern of behavior, or the artifacts like laws or rules or whatever, that characterizes a group of people, a collectivity, and is based on shared beliefs and understandings that justify that behaviors. So actually my inclination is to link that second part, this kind of based on shared beliefs and behaviors. I think, closer to Johannes. I see that as kind of institutional logic, and it would be useful to distinguish that from the behavioral manifestations of the logic. But I don't want to get into that debate about what's an institutional logic. So I'm just going to call this an institution. It's a package. It's the behavior and the ideology, or the more subjective aspects. Now, entrepreneurship is maybe even more etymologically challenged than institution, if that's possible. There are a wide variety of definitions of what you need in order to characterize something as entrepreneurship, which range from fairly narrow definitions. Again, this follows the more Schumpeter sort of approach, and so the focus is on innovation. So entrepreneurship is something that involves creating new products, new services that ultimately lead to new markets. And if it's not innovative, then it's not entrepreneurship, really. It's something else. Others take a much broader view and include basically all attempts to found new economic organizations, whether they're in existing old markets or new markets, it doesn't matter. Our approach is much closer to that latter big tent kind of definition. So we just define entrepreneurship as efforts that are aimed at establishing a new firm. There are a couple of, I think, advantages to this. One is that, first of all, it's in line with a lot of the empirical work that is has been done on entrepreneurship, which often uses just self-employment as an index. So rates of self-employment is taken as a measure of entrepreneurial activity. It's also consistent with more policy-oriented foci, which policymakers are usually interested in trying to understand generating more economic activity. It's not so much a matter of, is this innovative or not? So I think there are good reasons to actually take the kind of broader definition. And then, so you put those together, and when you talk about entrepreneurship as an institution or entrepreneurial institutions, we define it as patterns of behavior, again, that are tied to a specific group of people that are shared by a group, involving creating new firms, and are based upon kind of an institutional logic, if you will, or we'll just say shared beliefs and understandings that justify and guide those behaviors. Okay, so as I said at the outset, I think one piece of evidence for studying entrepreneurship as an institution is the degree of variability that exists across countries in terms of both attitudes towards becoming self-employed and also actual rates of entrepreneurial activity. So I'm going to show you some data that kind of are consistent with this idea, or making my case for looking at entrepreneurship as an institution. And I should say that, okay, so one argument, so I'm going to show you these data, and I'm anticipating a pushback argument, which is that yeah, there's a lot of variation across countries, but that's all due to differences in national laws and economic conditions and these very material sorts of things that affect individuals' calculations of the cost and benefits, and it has nothing to do with shared understandings or attitude, kind of these cultural aspects. And I would say yes, that's true in part. I would never try and say that has individual calculations have nothing to do with entrepreneurial behavior. That doesn't make sense. And obviously we need to look at those things in terms of explaining why people enter into entrepreneurship. There are variations across countries that are very similar in kind of the social safety net policies and other kinds of aspects of rules and regulations that you would think would fit, have that kind of effect on individuals' calculations. So similar countries, you still find a lot of variation across them in terms of these attitudes and behaviors that are involved in entrepreneurship. So hopefully I've headed off that challenge at the pass. And one other caveat that I should offer, which is that the data that I'm going to show you are not data that we created. We just gathered it from existing studies. And so they come from different sets of samples, different data collection efforts. And they also are for different time periods. So they don't mesh together perfectly, but you could also say, well, that makes the case even stronger because we've got independent samples and we've got kind of time changes going on here. So insofar as we find relationships across countries that are consistent, provides more evidence for our case. Okay, so to the data. I want to start by showing you some work from a study actually that I did with a graduate student that looked at differences in people's attitudes towards becoming, oh, sorry, I forgot one other point. I'll get to that. I'll just show you. Read it, and I'll talk about it later. Okay, so these data come from a study that I did with Lena Hipp, and we used data from the International Social Science Program, I think is what it's, ISSP is the acronym. And this is information, surveys that are done by this organization every year of a number of different countries, different years. They look at different sorts of questions. In 2005, which these data are drawn from, they ask people questions about their interest in becoming self-employed. And here, we used respondents who were currently employed, salary employed, and the question that they were asked is, would you prefer to be self-employed if you were able to do so? Okay, so you can see there's quite a range in terms of the proportion of people in different countries. So at one end you have Korea, in which almost 2/3 of the employees wish they or would like to be self-employed, so they say, down to Belgium at the low end, less than 20%, and Scandinavian countries as well. Canada and the US, British and her colonies tend to be at the high ends as well. Okay, so that's one. You see this a lot of variation across countries. You also see, as I said in the beginning, countries that are fairly similar. You also find a fair amount of variation. So as I said, Belgium's down here at 19%, but the Netherlands, a country that's close by and that I think has many similar kinds of, it's a similar setting, similar kinds of rules and regulations, up to 29% of the respondents wanted to be self-employed. And then here in Germany, again, some differences obviously between all these countries, but there's a striking increase in the proportion of people who are interested in becoming self-employed. Likewise, at the high end of the spectrum, you have Canadians who are quite enthusiastic, about 53% would like to be self-employed. The mother country, the UK, on the other hand, you see that drop by 10 percentage points. So even within countries that, even across countries that are fairly similar, you get a lot of variation. Okay, and then you can overlay that with actual entrepreneurial activity. And these data come from a second study that was done by Ardagna and Lusardi, published in, it was an NBER paper. And they used data from the Global Enterprise, Entrepreneurship Monitor, GEM data, which again is another organization that surveys people in different countries. They are very much, they're focused explicitly always on entrepreneurial activities. And they have a measure of entrepreneurship which is focusing on how much time you've spent engaged in trying to get a new business started in the last 3 years, I think it is. So there you can see not perfect, but a fairly good correspondence between kind of these attitudinal, would you like to be self-employed, and the actual behaviors of it. One obvious kind of takeaway from this is that there's a lot more interest in becoming self-employed than there is actual behavior. But generally, at the high end, you have countries where there's a lot of interest. There's also a fair amount higher than average level of activity. So we have Korea, US, Canada at this end. And at the other end, you have countries in which there's not much expressed interest. There's also, perhaps not too surprisingly, also not a lot of activity on that. The one kind of thing that keeps us from being a better corresponding line are Finland, Norway, and Denmark, where you have not so much interest in, not expressed interest in becoming self-employed, but a relatively, comparatively higher rates of entrepreneurship. So if I could take those three cases out, the correspondence would be higher. So you see a lot of cross-country variation, both in attitudes and behavior, that are consistent with this idea that there's something cultural going on there. It's not just social policies. Finally, a third set of data comes from a study that was done by a couple of economists, Fairley and Myers, that used information from the 1990 U.S. Census, in which there was a question where people were asked to indicate their country of origin, their national ancestry. And so they matched those data with data from the census on are you self-employed, and looked at, do you find differences within a given country in terms of the backgrounds of the people who are in self-employment. So in their analysis, they found, first of all, they found significant differences. You can see you can see the effects of being in the same country, in the US, because they're all sort of for the most part, kind of topped off here, hovering around 10 to 11%, which is the US average. But you also see, again, there are clearly Koreans high end. I don't know what it is about Korea that inclines people to entrepreneurship. That's probably a study in its own right, because it's really striking. But also Canada and UK are up there at the high end. And again, we have Belgium, and this says Sweden. That's actually, I should have changed it on the Excel file. It's Scandinavia. In their data, they combined people who came from Finland, Norway, and Scandinavian countries. So you have, as in the previous data, you have these people who are much more inclined to, even in a different cultural context, to persist in entrepreneurial activity. And I'll pop it back to the thing that I just showed you. And at the low end, you have countries that, in their country of origin, not so much interest, not so much behavior. You put them in the US, not so much interest, not so much behavior. Whoops. Back. Okay, so you may not have needed this much persuasion that, in fact, there is this kind of cross-national variation in entrepreneurship. But now you hopefully are persuaded, and of the need to then try and understand what causes these kinds of variations in the phenomena of interest. Okay, so as I said, this kind of variability is actually in line with current work in institutional theory that suggests that institutions can vary in ways in different sorts of context. Now, that's not the traditional focus of institutional theory, which has usually been on trying to document the social forces that lay behind the spread of some given institution, policy, or practice. And in particular, the typical story focuses on how, as the proportion of adopters of some innovation increases, the likelihood that those who have not yet adopted will also go up dramatically. And you get that kind of S-shaped curve that Alexander showed yesterday. And there's often been little or no attention given to whether that thing that is being adopted, spreading across different adopters, is exactly the same, or is it mutating, as it changing a little bit? So usually adoption by person one or unit one is treated as being the same as the thing that is adopted by the second person or unit and by the third person or unit, and so on. But more recent work that has been done by a number of researchers, including Shaz Ansari, who I gather was one of the people that I missed, but also people that he has worked with, Pierre Fiss and Davis et al., also provide evidence that we need to actually look a lot more closely at these institutions that are institutions in the sense of patterns of behavior that are spreading across time, that are being adopted. So Kennedy and Fiss, for example, did a study looking at the adoption of total quality management by hospitals, which was an organizational practice that spread widely in the 1980s. And what they found was that early adopters of total quality management tended to have a lot more people in the hospital involved in training, and also had it used in a lot of different units in the hospital. On the other hand, over time, the amount of training that people were given in this particular technique and the number of different units that were asked to implement it also shrank. So this total quality management at time 1 was a little different by the time you got to time 10 or 12 or, you know, further down the line. Another study by Fiss and Davis did a sort of similar kind of analysis of the adoption of golden parachutes, which, does everybody know what a golden parachute is? This is a package, a practice that became popular, certainly in U.S. corporations. I don't know whether it did outside of the U.S., but in the 1990s. So it involved severance arrangements for executives who lost their jobs because their companies were acquired by another company. And so partly it was, you know, I think it originated in an effort to stop the corporate raiding, to make it more costly to take over another firm. But what Fiss, Davis, and Kennedy showed was that actually if you so this practice spread in the 1990s like wildfire, and by the end of the decade, I've forgotten, 60-70% of all major corporations had one of these packages for their executives. But what Fiss, Davis, and Kennedy showed was that, again, what was entailed in this notion of golden parachute changed as time went by. So originally, it's actually kind of the opposite of the TQM story. The number of executives that were covered by it and the kinds of benefits that were guaranteed were relatively narrow. But as more and more people adopted it, it became more and more managers were covered by it, and a greater number of benefits often were encompassed. Not completely time dependent, because it also was affected by whether the corporation got a lot of media attention, in which case you did not see this kind of the expansion of a golden parachute as an institution, or if they had highly concentrated ownership, again. So individual characteristics of the firms affected the way in which this institution was manifested. So I think that this work is actually really promising and offers some interesting new avenues for institutional theorists to take. And I think in particular that it offers some very useful insights for thinking about entrepreneurship as an institution. So what's going to be entailed in that? Well, first of all, it means that we need to spend some time thinking about what are the key dimensions along which this thing, entrepreneurship, is likely to vary across groups. What do we need to kind of focus on in our studying? So, for example, one dimension might be the degree to which being an entrepreneur is seen as an acceptable way to make a living, which is in line with the earlier work that I was showing you. So in some cases, Belgium, the institution of entrepreneurship is a little more shaky in terms of being acceptable. Places like Korea, on the other hand, quite the opposite. Another dimension that possibly could be studied would be the degree to which when you start to found a firm, do you go out and look for external sources of funding typically, or do you rely on internal generated resources? There's also a kind of interesting dimension that might be relevant to what Johannes was talking about, which is when entrepreneurs when they found a firm, are thinking this is going to go on and on across generations, or do they think, I'm going to do this, found this firm, and I'm going to sell it as soon as possible, which certainly in the US has become an increasing pattern in entrepreneurial activity. So you found a firm almost like buying stock and hoping that you can drive the price of that up and then sell it. So different kinds of things that could be looked at. And then once we define those dimensions, we need to think about trying to figure out what are the sources of variations in that. So in our what we explore in our study are two dimensions, as I said in the beginning. One is the kind of pathways that may be taken into being an entrepreneur, and the other is the composition of the founding teams. So I can see my time is running out, and so let me try and go through this fairly quickly. So looking at pathways is a dimension of studying entrepreneurship. As I said, based on our review of the literature, we propose there are at least three major kinds of pathways that may be taken. One is innovation, which is the classic Schumpeterian sort of path where a person or a group comes up with inventing a new product or service. Then they create an organization in order to both develop the product and get it going and sell it and so forth. And that's usually, I think, the kind of image that is conjured up when I say entrepreneur in most people's minds. It certainly is one that's valorized in the popular press. You know, everything from magazines like Popular Mechanics to all these new books about Stephen Jobs or older books on Thomas Edison or so forth. I think it's actually probably a fairly rare pathway, you know, if you look across the world or maybe even across a given country, both because it involves coming up with new inventions, which is a pretty rare kind of phenomenon, but also because it requires the investments of large amounts of resources in order at the outset to push this and to make this kind of pathway feasible. So a couple of the other pathways I think are probably much more common, including apprenticeship. And this is a pathway that you find talked about a lot in the literature on ethnic entrepreneurship. And it involves going to work for some business as an employee, learning the ropes, figuring out how to do that, and then leaving your employer to found your own business once you've acquired that kind of basic skills and knowledge. So you see that a lot among some immigrant groups where a more established immigrant has founded a new business and then they go and hire other more recent immigrants from the same country to work for them. Oftentimes in very exploitive kind of conditions, very low pay, you work really low hours. There's some criticisms about the kind of moral rightness of this, but as people have pointed out, it also means it gives people a chance to learn a new language, learn the customs of the new country, as well as acquire those basic skills before doing it. It's very common, particularly among Koreans and also Indian entrepreneurs, for what it's worth, just a little factoid. It's not confined, however, to immigrant groups. So, for example, there was a study that was done by Jesper Sorensen, 4 or 5 years ago, looking at self-employment in Denmark. And what he found was that typically people who were self-employed had previously been employed, much more likely to have been employed in very small firms rather than large corporations. And the argument is, again, because when you're in a small firm, you usually are involved in a lot of different activities, you get a chance to learn the ropes. So much like the immigrant entrepreneurship literature. And then a third pathway is what we call the casual pathway. Again, you see this talked about in the ethnic entrepreneurship work on ethnic entrepreneurship, which involves starting business activities in the informal economy, so not really an organization, but doing things like selling, things at a flea market or a farmer's market or some other kind of venue. Once one becomes successful in that, then you begin to undertake the activities that are involved in starting a real formal organization and an enduring business firm. So the literature on ethnic entrepreneurship suggests this is common, particularly among immigrants that don't have a lot of education or resources to begin with. Literature on women in entrepreneurship also suggests this is not this is a fairly common pathway for women who often find that family responsibilities make it very hard for them to, survive as an organizational employee. So what they do is leave formal employment and then begin kind of these just to make money, informal, selling personal services, childcare, haircutting, whatever. And if they're successful over time, then it may morph into a more licensed, established business. So, as I said, there's the set of dimensions that we propose, and we also propose a number of factors that are likely to influence which pathway, and I'll give you just a sample to give you a sense of the propositions we lay out in the paper. So we argue that 2 minutes? Okay. Innovation? Wow. Innovation pathway. Sorry, I actually designed this for 45 minutes. I tried to make it shorter, but I'm not talking fast enough. Innovation pathway will be more common in wealthier communities. As I said, it requires a lot of resources to do this. This is actually literature on entrepreneurship. The GEM study suggests that poorer countries are more likely to have higher rates of entrepreneurship. I think that one thing that's missing in that research is that different pathways will be. So I would guess that poorer countries are more likely to be characterized by informal pathways, possibly apprenticeship. Apprenticeship pathways will be more common in communities with denser network ties because you need to have information flowing about who's looking for employees and what employees are looking for work, and you need a kind of strong network to mesh that information together. Whereas a casual pathway would be more common in less wealthy communities because it's an easier way to get into when you don't have a lot of resources, but also those with less dense network ties because you don't have that kind of information flow. And we also offer some propositions about kind of the consequences of this. So we argue that an apprenticeship program will result in organizational foundings that last long. And the logic is that that apprenticeships gives you the time to acquire the knowledge and background that's needed to actually succeed in entrepreneurship, whereas the other two pathways, you don't get that sort of training. Okay, so we do a sort of similar analysis talking about there are these different forms that newly founded firms take in terms of their governance structure. Solo, where you have a single individual who's in charge. Kin-based teams, in which you have the ownership held by members of a family. Typically a couple is the most common. I think you said 85% in Europe. Work by Martin Roof in the US suggests about 50%. And then you have unrelated teams, so people who aren't family members, maybe members of a common occupational group, co-workers in another firm, and so forth. And again, we walk through different kinds of conditions under which you're likely to find these different sorts of structures. And I'm using community as a unit of analysis. We could be talking about nation states. We could be talking about variation within a country, regional differences, or even within a city, different areas, and so forth. But the key is I think we need to focus on community characteristics in terms of our explanations. So, in conclusion, a couple of things. So the paper is intended, as I think is fairly obvious, to be not conclusive, more generative. We're trying to lay out a research agenda here that we're hoping will catch on, because we think that if entrepreneurship is actually going to survive as an area of academic study as opposed to the kind of the hot topic today, based on the success of Silicon Valley and then gone tomorrow. We actually need to have a more developed theoretical conceptualization of entrepreneurship as a social phenomenon. And we would argue that when we talk about entrepreneurship in Jordan, it may be a very different or a slightly different thing than entrepreneurship in Silicon Valley, and again, a different thing than you find, say, here in Heidelberg. So we want to push that, and we want to encourage comparative research that's aimed at understanding this phenomenon. So that's what this is about. Thank you.